Okay, maybe we get started. So hi everyone, thank you very much for coming to this research seminar series, session 50. Today, I'm Shuping Li, an associate professor from Hong Kong Poly U, and also a micro research committee member. Today, I'm very honored to host Professor Donal Crilly from London Business School. I know everyone is here now because of Donald, and I'm happy to introduce him later, but I want to take the opportunity to promote IACMR a little bit. So I want to highlight two issues about IACMR at this point. The first one is that we actually have this monthly research seminar series alternating between micro and macro topics and Chinese and English seminars. And we do have this WeChat group and also official platform for you to follow the updates. So if you are new to this community, please scan the QR code and join the community for later seminars, right? Usually we will have 35 minutes, seminar. So today, Donna will give about 45 minutes talk and then followed by 30 minutes Q&A. Right? Another thing I want to highlight here is that we're going to have the IACMR conference in Xi'an next June. The submission system, paper submission system will be open from September 15th to October 25th. So we really look forward to your submissions to make a successful conference. And we also appreciate it if you can sign up for reviewing the papers for the conference. We greatly appreciate your service. Okay. Again, if you want to know more about the conference details, please scan the QR code here. We have a Chinese website, an English website that you can take a closer look. Now, let me bring your attention to our guest today. Professor Donal Crilly is, professor of strategy and entrepreneurship at London Business School, and as he just told me, he's also now the head of the department. So we really appreciate his time today to give us a talk. And I know, he has a long CV, and there are so many interesting things on the CV. But I just want to, for the time of the sake, I just want to highlight a few things that I find most interesting to me. Donal has this very interesting research on behavioral stakeholder theory. That's how I see his work, behavioral perspective of stakeholder management. Right? And his work mostly focuses on managerial cognition and intertemporal choices. Some recent work he is doing now concerns how leaders make sense of the future and balance pressures for short-term returns and long-term performance. So this is fascinating topic I personally find. And what's more interesting to me in his work is that he often uses mixed methods to address this behavioral perspective of stakeholder theory. So that appears in his past work, and it will appear in today's talk as well, multiple studies design. Not surprisingly, with this interesting topic and interesting approach, he has published in almost all the big journals, right? SMJ, AMJ, Oxines, even AMR and JIPS. So he's definitely a very prominent scholar in this domain, interesting domain. And the second thing I find very interesting is that, he actually has two PhDs, one in strategy from INSEAD and another in linguistics from UCL. So I guess that also shaped, his later research to some extent, analyzing language, etc. And also different from many, scholars, I think Donald is interesting in the sense that he has abundant industrial experiences. in both Europe and Asia. So that really helps connect the research to the industry closely, right? And also I find Donald really contributed to our community by serving associate editor at SMJ for 6 years. So this is a long-term service, and I think many of us might know him because of this role in the past, right? So we really appreciate that. So today, I think Donald will present one research that is very consistent with his past research profile, focusing on the temporal dimensions, right, in stakeholder relations or stakeholder management. So the title is Understanding Investor Impatience for Financial Returns and Social Outcomes, again, behavioral focus. And again, he will use a multi-study to demonstrate when investors will be impatient for financial returns versus social outcomes. So without further ado, and without spoiling the story, I will just pass the time to Donald now. So hope you will all enjoy the talk. And during the talk, if you have any questions, please feel free to type your questions in the chat box. I will turn to them at the end of the talk, or you can raise your questions directly after Donald's talk. Okay, so let's go this way. So Donald, it's all yours. I will stop sharing and you can share your slides.
Thank you, Shuping, for the introduction. Let me put this in presentation. So as your introduction was very on point, actually, because indeed this paper is very much related to some of my work on time and how both executives and their stakeholders, in this case their investors, make sense of the future. And the specific motivation for this paper is actually quite simple. Companies of many different types have increasingly incorporated some notion of social or societal benefit into their mission. So, for example, this is a social enterprise that claims to want to feed 10 million people in 10 years. This is an organization, again, a small social enterprise that wants to give 10,000 people safe drinking water. Here we see a larger public company, a utility company from Northern Ireland that wants to plant 1 million trees in 10 years. And what these projects or what these social outcomes have in common is that they typically take a long time to achieve. So we are well accustomed to the fact that oftentimes organizations will promise some financial return over a certain financial horizon, but it's also the case that organizations that promise societal benefits also take time to achieve these societal benefits. What's perhaps even more interesting is that the horizon taken to achieve these societal benefits is often actually even longer than the horizon required to achieve financial returns. I showed you the example of NI Water before, pledging to plant 1 million trees in 10 years. Well, actually, 10 years is a long time for somebody to hold stock in a particular company. And indeed, we have a lot of evidence that investors have a preference for immediate or at least quick financial returns. In fact, the evidence shows that this tendency for investors to prefer short-term returns over long-term returns is actually increasing. This also, of course, leads managers to often prioritize projects that will produce returns in the short term. And that potentially creates a dilemma for especially social enterprises that want to motivate investors to provide funding, but that are trying to realize societal objectives that could actually take a long time to realize or to achieve. A lot of the literature has argued that short-termism is a problem, that investors are short-termist. And what we're saying in this paper, or what we're aiming to do in this paper, is understand whether short-termism is really a unidimensional construct. And that's to say, whether investors or prospective investors react in the same way to long-term societal benefits as they would to long-term or distant financial returns for themselves. So the research aim is essentially, as stated at the bottom of the slide, to understand how investors evaluate future societal outcomes and how this affects investments in social enterprises. I stated that the general assumption in the literature is that short-termism is unidimensional. That's to say, investors are short-termist. But that's probably not the case, because we can think about an organization that tries to achieve financial and social outcomes. It's possible that an organization will have a long-term financial goal, but a short-term social goal. One could think of many social enterprises that are aiming to achieve societal benefit today in the hope of having a business model that may create profits, but aware that it will take time for these profits to be achieved. So you could have the case of having immediate social benefits with perhaps long-term financial returns, or the prospect of long-term financial returns for the investor. At the same time, however, many large organizations such as NI Water, I showed you before, actually are trying to promise short-term financial returns to their investors whilst having a long-term social objective, so planting trees in 10 years' time. So we have essentially different combinations. How does this work in practice? Well, these are two specific organizations. On the left, you see a social enterprise. It has a goal. It's essentially a animal welfare social enterprise. Its stated goal is to save an additional 1,000 penguins in the next year. And it has a certain business model, so it's trying to sell certain products. But it hopes to generate profit in 10 years' time. So there you see a very immediate societal benefit and the potential for financial benefit or financial return, but achieving that will take longer. On the other hand, what's probably more common these days is for an organization such as this packaging company to aim for profit in the more immediate future. So in this case, profiting from introducing reusable straws, but with a very long-term and temporally distant social objective of reducing 20,000 kilograms of plastic waste in the oceans within 10 years. So you see, what's important here is that one can have a long-term financial horizon and a short-term societal horizon, or vice versa, or both could be aligned. So the emphasis here is that short-termism is not necessarily a unidimensional construct. Now, what does the literature on discounting say? There's a lot of literature on how individuals discount financial returns for themselves. But there are two streams of literature that are more specifically tailored to understanding how people might discount long-term societal benefits. The first is a stream of literature called social discounting. Social discounting is essentially, how do you evaluate money that will go to other people in the future? If, let's say, we know that we are always impatient for ourselves, we would typically prefer $100 today rather than $110 in a year's time. But if we're thinking about if we were making that decision for somebody else, for example, a family member, actually the literature shows that on average people are more patient. So if I'm making a decision for a child, I might say, well, I would prefer that he has $110 in a year's time rather than $100 today. The literature here is not necessarily unambiguous. So there is some evidence that people are also impatient. But the idea is that at least where it comes to financial gifts such as wills, inheritance, there is even a sense that people may even overvalue the long-term financial returns to others. And it's probably related to this idea of leaving a legacy. So societal benefits certainly go to other people, but this idea of social discounting only answers part of it, because societal benefits are actually typically not financial benefits. They're typically products or trees or some kind of service that is provided. And here the literature is even more confusing. Do people discount societal outcomes? So if you are creating some environmental benefit, and this benefit is going to exist in 10 years' time, is that substantially of less interest or value to you than the same environmental benefit created today? The literature here is very thin, and it is mainly in the domain of behavioral economics. It finds very little consensus. The initial papers said that there was minimal discounting. That's to say, the environmental benefits that were created 10 years from now are essentially evaluated as equal to those created today. This was an initial paper by Boehm and Vista, who looked at environmental risk. But other papers more recently have found people potentially discount environmental benefits in exactly the same way as money. So they are just as impatient. These studies potentially have a difficulty, which is that it's very difficult for these studies to compare the discounting of financial returns and the discounting of societal benefits on an equal basis. Why? Well, some studies will create some measure of discounting, but it will often be based on discounting, for example, what is the discount factor applied to $10,000 versus what is the discount factor applied to planting 100 trees. And the difficulty there is one of a magnitude effect. If we are comparing apples and oranges, how do we state that discounting of societal benefits is either higher or lower? This is one of the tasks that we will try to address in today's study. So we have three different studies in this paper. And the first is essentially just to have, under very controlled conditions, a sense of whether individuals are more patient for societal benefits than they are for money for themselves. And the design of this particular study will try and address the magnitude problem that I mentioned on this particular slide. We then bring this to a rail setting where we have social enterprise pitches, and we see how the ventures motivate the financial horizon of their the temporal horizon of their financial returns as well as of their societal benefits, and see how prospective investors react. Then we go to design a policy capturing study where we build on the archival study but aim for cleaner causal identification. So the first study answers this simple question: do prospective investors discount financial and social gains differently? So we create a study which is incentivized. That's to say that the choices that individuals make in this particular experiment are rewarded. Specifically, we ended up paying a bonus of approximately $400 either to a particular charity or to the participants themselves. We have 213 experienced investors, and each of these investors responds to two series of three choices. One of the choices is to understand to what extent are these individuals impatient for financial returns for themselves. In order to calculate this, we use this choice list, which has been used in many other temporal discounting studies. So in this specific case, we ask the individual to state that he or she is given a choice between receiving $100 in 6 months' time. What is the equivalent that he or she would need today to make that equivalent? So in this particular case, the individual would prefer to receive $100, $95, $90, or $85 today, would today rather than $100 in 6 months' time. But if it's $80 or less, he or she would prefer to wait the 6 months and gain the larger prize of $100. In this case, we calculate present equivalent. So the present equivalent is essentially the switching point, which is somewhere between $80 and $85. So in this case, we assume $82.5. The important thing to note is that this allows us to create a discount factor. The discount factor then is 0.825. So a discount factor is always between 0 and 1. And a discount factor means a high discount factor means more patience. So discount factor is essentially the inverse of discount rate. Okay? So we calculate a discount factor for each participant for financial gains that he or she, him or herself would gain in 6 months' time. And we replicate this over a 12-month delay. And we also have the individuals decide how measure choices between 6 months and 12 months. So each individual completes a series of 3 choices for the financial returns. But in order to measure patience for societal benefits, we also partner with an environmental charity called One Tree Planted. One Tree Planted is a charity to which you can donate $1, and for each dollar donated, the charity will plant 1 tree. So we randomly assign half of the participants to group 1 and half to group 2. Group 1, here they are told that they're making a choice between dollars given to the charity today and dollars given to the charity in the future. And they're told that the dollars will each dollar leads to the planting of 1 tree. So that here they're making a choice between $100 donated to the charity in 6 months' time. How much dollars would need to be donated to that charity today to make it essentially equivalent? Group 2, however, are told not that it's simply dollars being donated, but simply number of trees being planted. So instead of 100 trees being planted in 6 months' time, how many trees would need to be planted today? Note that then these conditions are actually equivalent because both groups are aware that each dollar is equivalent to 1 tree being planted, and that 1 tree being planted would cost $1 in donation. I mean, that is inherent in the description that we give the participants. The order, by the way, between the conditions is naturally randomized. So some participants will see the social cause condition before thinking about the financial benefits for themselves, and vice versa. So how does this then look in practice? Well, if we look at the full sample, here we are predicting patience. So by patience, we're essentially looking at the discount factor. And on the aggregate sample, you will find that the coefficients are positive and generally statistically significant. What that implies is that people are more patient on average when they discount societal benefits than when they discount money for themselves. So that's the meaning of this this coefficient, societal versus self. To what extent are you more patient for the societal benefit? That's perhaps not so surprising. It's consistent with some of this work that on average people may be less discounting societal benefits. To be specific, the present equivalent is 5.1% greater for societal benefits at the 6-month period, and it is 9.6% greater at the 12-month period. So over a 12-month delay, people tend to be about 10% more patient for societal benefits than they are for financial benefits for themselves. However, part of our design, I said, was that the societal benefits are described in one of 2 ways. Either we're looking at financial benefits going to a societal cause, or directly we are manipulating the societal benefits. And this is where the results become more interesting, because here we break the samples down into the participants who are thinking about donations to the particular charity. And in this case, we're looking at the direct societal benefits themselves. So here it's money going to the social organization. Here it is numbers of trees being planted. Even though, by the way, the important thing is there is a direct equivalence between tree being planted and money donated. So what we find is that there is no significant difference between how patient people are when it comes to money for themselves versus money for a social entity that is going to lead to trees being planted. When, however, the difference is between numbers of trees being planted today and numbers of trees being planted in the future, that is where the difference becomes important. So again, here there's no noticeable difference in investors' patience when it comes to societal benefits that are described in a financial sense, but there is an important difference when these societal benefits are described in non-financial sense, and simply not enumerated in terms of money, but simply in terms of trees. So what is our overall finding from this research? So the overall finding is that people are more impatient. That's to say, they discount financial rewards for themselves more heavily than they do societal benefits. So on average, people are more impatient towards financial goals. However, this is especially true when the social outcomes are not expressed in monetary terms. If we are talking about, if we express the societal benefit in terms of money, then people discount those societal benefits in exactly the same way as they would financial returns for themselves. So again, just to reiterate, what we specifically find is that when these social returns are non-monetary, that's to say described in terms of trees, prospective investors are more patient, about 15.6% more patient over a 12-month period. When, however, the social returns are described in a financial sense, i.e., we will be cleaning up the environment at equivalent to a certain amount of money, then prospective investors are not more patient. How does this play out in the real world? I mean, one of the disadvantages of this particular study is that the individual investors are making choices separately based on societal benefits and separately based on financial returns to themselves. In the case of most enterprises, social enterprises, organizations are simultaneously motivating societal benefits and financial return. So in this case, we look at evidence from the field, and we look at a real-world context where small ventures are trying to raise money from prospective investors. And all of these ventures have a social mission or objective. So specifically, we work with the organization startsomegood.com. It is an Australian-based organization that helps ventures to gain funding. But most of the projects are not based in Australia. They're based across the world. And we look at all of their pitches over a 10-year period. There are about 1,400. In reality, 100 and 50 are missing data. So we have approximately 1,300 in the final sample. There are 17 different project categories, including, for example, environment, health, community, indigenous relations. And we look at how successful these organizations are in terms of raising funds, and in terms of in a dollar amount, as well as the number of funders that they're able to attract. We create measures of their financial horizon, as well as the temporal horizon or distance of the societal benefits that they are claiming to achieve. And I will explain soon how we do so, but we use essentially two measures. One is a dictionary-based measure based on Lee's paper in Journal of Accounting and Economics 2008, where she looks at future language as a ratio over past and present-oriented language. We employ exactly the same method, but we also complement this with machine learning, whereby we look at how the words in the pitches are more or less similar to the words in the dictionaries that Lee was using, which creates a slightly more nuanced measure, because with her dictionary, there are some pitches that don't include many time-based words at all. We also control for various features of the individual projects. The nice thing about these projects is that each project has two different web pages. The first is what is called the offering or project description. In this case, we are looking at an educational organization that wants to provide education to otherwise disadvantaged students. So this is essentially describing more or less the social mission of the venture. But there's also a separate page that details elements of the funding or the financial project. So in this case, what investment is sought, over what time will the investment be paid back. And this allows us then to calculate a separate measure of horizon or temporal distance for the social part of the business, i.e. the societal benefit, in this case, providing education to disadvantaged students. But it also allows us to create a second separate measure of temporal distance, in this case, for the financial benefits that are likely to go to the investors. What do we find? Well, in this case, let's look at columns 1 to 3. So here we're using the dictionary-based measure of temporal distance. And what we find is that the coefficient is negative for temporal distance in the financial domain. So that's to say, essentially, the longer your financial horizon, the less likely you are to raise a lot of funds. So the dependent variable here is the dollar sum of funds raised. On the other hand, the coefficients for temporal distance in the social domain, that's to say the delay before you achieve the social benefits you're promising, there the coefficients are not significant. In columns 4 to 6, we replicate the analysis, but here we are using the machine learning based approach, which is based on Gennaro and Ash. It's a slightly more sophisticated way of measuring temporal distance. And there we find essentially very similar results. That's to say, if you are promising financial returns only in the long term, again, on average, you're going to be less successful in raising funds, but we don't find any relationship for, in the case of temporally distant social benefits. Here you can see we have year fixed effects, category fixed effects. We also, in other specifications, we also look at interactions between various specific categories and temporal distance in the societal domain, and the results are broadly the same. Here we are looking at the number of funders, because you could have a project that receives substantial funding, but from very few investors, or vice versa. But here the results broadly substantiate what we were showing on the previous slide. So here for the dictionary-based measures, having long-term financial goals or expressing long-term temporal horizons for financial returns is negative. So it's associated with a lower number of funders. That applies both for the dictionary-based measures as well as for the machine learning enhanced measures. For societal distance or temporal distance in the societal domain, that's to say you're essentially promising societal benefits after a long period. Again, there is no significant effect in terms of social distance on number of funders, except for marginally significant negative effect for one of the machine learning measures, but not in the complete model. So what does this imply? Well, we find, consistent with what we were showing in the previous study, we show that, as we would expect, having distant financial outcomes is negative for investment. There is not, however, any discernible effect of distant societal goals on investment, which is perhaps surprising given that this is a relatively conservative scenario, that the investors on this platform are all relatively socially motivated. So we may think that they would prioritize societal benefits and their the ability for them to be realized in the immediate future over financial returns. But even here, we find there is no important effect of temporal distance on societal goals, on the number of funders, or on the overall funding amount. This study is, of course, limited in the way that all non-experimental studies are. We cannot easily tease out any, causality. So we then create, finally, a policy capturing study. So in this case, we are able to manipulate pitches, and we are able to manipulate the temporal horizon until the venture achieves financial returns, and the temporal horizons for the venture to achieve societal returns. In this particular case, we also work with experienced investors, and we develop 4 different scenarios that are based on the most popular categories on the Start Some Good website or Start Some Good platform. These are the natural environment, community, children and youth, and health. And we have a 2x2 factorial design. That's to say, we manipulate the temporal distance or horizon of societal objectives, and we also manipulate the temporal distance or horizon of the financial objectives. And we replicate this across the 4 different scenarios. So that's that each participant will evaluate 4 scenarios, one from each of these 4 different categories. So, example, this is an example of the pitch in the environmental category. This is the social enterprise based in Australia, trying to protect the oceans from increasing pollution. And we indicate the expected time for this organization to turn a profit, and we also indicate the expected time for this organization to generate social impact. Here we use 8 years and 1 year. We've also played with different time horizons as well. And the decision maker in this case makes 2 choices. He or she firstly decides how motivated they are to invest in the venture on a scale of 1 to 5. We also allow the person to imagine an endowment of $2,000. How much would you invest in this particular venture? The alternative is to put it in an account that will pay 1% interest. So, of course, within any individual project category, we actually have 4 potential combinations of financial return and societal benefits. We could have them aligned, as in the diagonal, or in the off diagonal, they could be misaligned. The order at which we show the financial return and the social impact is also randomized. So that's to say, half of the participants will see the social impact before they see the profit sign or the financial return sign, so that we do not prime them in any unfortunate way. So what do we find? Well, when it comes to investing, that's to say the 5-point scale we use to evaluate whether people will invest in the venture or not, systematically the financial distance is negative. So the longer the long temporal horizon is associated with less motivation to invest. It is also negative for societal distance, although somewhat less. So it's approximately one third or 1/4 the magnitude of the negative effect of temporal distance in the financial domain. Here we're looking at the proportion of the $2,000 endowment that the investor will allocate to that particular venture. And in this case, again, you'll find that the coefficients are negative. They are also negative for the temporal distance to have a social impact, but again, the coefficients are much higher. The difference in coefficients between temporal distance or horizons for the financial returns and for societal benefits are significantly different at the p equals 0.001 level of significance. So what is the result here? Well, the temporal distance of both financial and societal outcomes is negative, but it is substantially more strong and negative for the financial goals than for the societal goals. Interestingly, we also find some evidence of complementarity, which is that where there is an alignment between the financial and the societal goals in terms of their temporal horizon, investors may at the margin be more positive. We also use this particular experiment to probe why it is that in some cases, temporal distance to achieve societal benefits may negatively predict investment. And we actually look at a number of potential mechanisms. We did not theorize these, have explicit hypotheses in advance, but looking at the literature, we thought there were probably three particular mechanisms that would be at play. The first was perhaps perceived ambition. One assumption might be that if you have long-term financial goals, you're not going to have a social impact until, for example, 8 years. Perhaps investors perceive that venture as being more ambitious in terms of the financial goals that it is pursuing. We did not find any evidence for that mechanism. We also looked at perceived impact, whether the perceived impact of the venture was greater if it had a long-term social objective or was going to create social value after only a long period of time. But again, we found no evidence for that. The one mechanism we did find evidence for was the perceived abstraction or abstractness of the venture itself, which was that the goals of the venture were perceived to be more abstract when it was pursuing temporally distant social impact. And this perceived abstractness also predicted a lack of willingness to invest in the venture. Here I'm showing the 5-point investment scale, but the same will apply for the amounts of money allocated to that particular venture. So it seems that on average, social distance isn't highly negative, but to the extent that it is often explained by having goals that are perceived as being more abstract. And the important thing to note is that in our policy capturing study, the description of the goal was identical. The only thing that changed was indeed the description of the time taken to achieve it. What does this imply? Well, there's a lot of work and interest these days on investors being short-termist. But I said at the outset that oftentimes we assume that short-termism is a unidimensional construct. What we show is that indeed time matters for monetary and societal outcomes. It's not only money, even though that's where most of the focus of the research has been, but it's also for societal outcomes. And what we find is that people do discount societal and financial outcomes differently. Generally, they discount financial outcomes more severely. That's to say they're more impatient for financial outcomes than for societal outcomes. But this also has implications for organizations' efforts to attach financial value to societal outcomes. Oftentimes these days, organizations will try and enumerate or attach financial value to the social good that they are doing. What this paper suggests is that that may actually be disadvantageous because prospective stakeholders may then evaluate these future societal benefits less positively when they are made equivalent to a financial figure. So importantly, again, we also find that these temporally distant societal outcomes are viewed negatively when they are perceived as being more abstract, maybe less realizable than temporally proximate goals. So this is one paper in a range of studies that I have. Given the nature of this audience, let me just finish with one other thing that I am working on at the moment, which is, one of my interests is on linguistic relativity. And I don't speak Chinese, but I do speak Japanese. And it's always interested me how different languages partition the future in different ways. So clearly you can think, at least in Japanese, I know that mirai is used these characters are used to describe a more long distant and aspirational future, and Shodai is used more to describe a very impending or imminent future, much more concrete. And I think this is an interesting, this offers interesting potential for research. The other thing that's interesting is how languages describe human agency with respect to the future. English, for example, as opposed to some other European languages, including German, is more likely to describe individuals as being agentic with respect to the future. They are approaching the future rather than the future is approaching them. Having done some analysis of Chinese companies' annual reports, I believe that English is also more agentic than Chinese with respect to how the future is described. Again, I think this also offers some interesting potential for research. If you have any interest in discussing these ideas, let me know, because these are ideas that are at the forefront of my mind at the moment. So thank you for your patience, and if you have questions, I am happy to take them.
Shuping 老师, I think you're muted.
Okay. Thank you, Donal, for the wonderful presentation just now. I can see very clear implications to stakeholder management and strategic communication literatures, based on this research. And maybe the behavioral strategy interest group will be interested as well, right? So you used the time perfectly, 45 minutes. Now let's open the floor to the audience for them to ask some questions. I think first, Zhiyan raised 2 questions, right? Zhiyan, do you mind just speak out?
Yeah, sure, Shuping. Thank you, Donal. It's a very interesting study, also very rigorously examined. Maybe it's too fast. I didn't follow everything, so I just have some clarification questions. So for study 1, it seems to me, at least conceptually, the participants seem to be more like donors rather than investors. Because investors, they invest money, they hope to get at least some financial returns. But in study 1, I think there is no financial returns to the participants at all. So basically, they are actually donating things, regardless of the return, whether it's trees or kind of a donation to the charities. So I wonder if this is a potential issue for theory data alignment, because your theory centers on investment, which cares about financial returns. Yeah, so this is my first question.
Okay, thank you. So good question. Let me explain. So actually, the first study is largely within subject design. That's to say, the individual makes decisions based on financial returns to him or herself. So instead of, for example, $100 in 6 months' time, how much money would you need today for that to be equivalent? So let's say you state, I would need $80, then we calculate the present equivalent, and we compare that to the case of the societal benefits. So we are able to compare whether the individual is more impatient for the financial returns to him or herself than to the societal benefit that would be created.
Thanks for the explanation. Sorry, maybe I didn't explain myself clearly. I think I'm referring to the tree example, because you also have this tree example as the experiment. So I'm mainly targeting that.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, but in that case, I think that's fine, because the societal benefit in the case of this social enterprise is typically not going to the investors themselves. It's going to society. So it's not going, it's the financial return that goes to the investor. The societal benefit will almost always go to other people. That's why I mentioned the social discounting example before. The social discounting literature looks at benefits that go to other people. And when we look at societal outcomes, there are 2 features of them. The first is that they go to other people, not to ourselves. And the second is that they are typically non-financial in nature. So we could either describe it in terms of number of trees or in terms of numbers of money going towards this issue. Those are essentially equivalent, but the important thing is that the beneficiary is somebody different. However, I think the point is well taken in the sense that, what I was emphasizing is that that's why we needed to do study 2 as well, to look at the combination or the confluence of the societal benefit and the financial return, because in reality, a prospective investor will be thinking about these two elements simultaneously. So we simply had study 1 as in answering a very high level question, which is how people evaluate societal benefits in the future versus financial returns in the future. But it is well taken.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I have a second question, but I can let others ask first, I think. Yeah.
So there is a question about modeling potential loss instead of temporal discount into the empirical design to reflect the investors' incentives. Are you here? Do you mind elaborate your question a little bit? So I'm not sure what the question.
Maybe I can try and
sure.
share what the question means. So I think there are two elements here. The first is this potentially raises something that's actually quite interesting. We know that individuals discount losses differently than they discount gains.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's one element. In actual fact, we have done separate studies looking at a related element, which is whether the organization is trying to not only, let's say, do socially good, but also minimize social harm. Because if we think of the gain versus loss framing, how does that apply in the case of societal benefits? Organizations are not typically, they're not going to announce the fact that they are doing environmental damage, but they may announce the fact that they're trying to mitigate loss versus as in reduce, for example, pollution, versus do good, i.e. create some gains for society. So, and we did find some interesting effects there, which is where that the societal benefits that were more, let's say, gain oriented tended to be discounted more than those that were more mitigating societal negatives. The second element may be related to the fact that there is no guarantee of gaining any positive results, either in terms of societal benefits or in terms of financial gain. I mean, we don't manipulate that in the experiment, but generally one of the assumptions in most of the discounting research is that indeed the longer the temporal horizon, the greater uncertainty about the investment outcome is. And that's often why investors are more reluctant to allocate funds to a project that will have a long financial horizon. We could look at that in study 2. We could probably look at various measures of risk, and I think that would be a productive avenue to explore.
Okay, does that address your question?
Yeah, thank you, Professor. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, I just have an internet problem. Thank you for answering this question. And I think in your frame, it's a fair comparison between the social goal and the financial goal instead and beyond, regardless of the investor incentive. Yeah. And one more thing I want to address is the final slides about the language and the time framework. I read some story that the English is very emphasized on the tense, like I was used to and going to, yeah. But in Chinese, we just mixed, for example, 我今天,我明天. So the people who speak English will emphasize more on the time structure. They may have systematically different behaviors related to these habits.
嗯，
And one more thing I want to address is the final slides about the language and the time framework. I read some story that the English is very emphasized on the tense, like I was used to and going to, yeah. But in Chinese, we just mixed, for example, 我今天,我明天. So the people who speak English will emphasize more on the time structure. They may have systematically different behaviors related to these habits.
Yes, indeed, and there is evidence that language, the use of tense in languages, does influence whether people view the future as being more distinct from the present. So there are some papers published in economics and management journals that show that. So languages like English that have a future tense, their speakers tend to be more present oriented, and the reason being that they more clearly distinguish the future as being something distinct or different from the present moment, so they value it less. Whereas if you're often using the present tense to describe the future, then they seem more similar.
Okay. Yeah. Can I have one more question? Because
sure.
because you mentioned the uncertainty mechanism, so I wonder if we can use confidence to explain the mechanism regarding different goals.
I think we can, to the extent that it's well established in the literature that
Okay.
if you have a short-term goal, investors or other stakeholders will typically find it more likely that that is going to be achieved. So that is definitely quite likely. Well, and that is perhaps explaining why there is still some marginal discounting for the societal benefit. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Professor. And that's all.
Zhiyan, I see that you still have 2 more questions about the study 2 and 3, right? Do you want to elaborate? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that my third question was already addressed by Donal in the first kind of response. It's a within subject design. I thought it was between subject design, so that there is no issue with the third question. The second question, actually, Donal, is that for the study 2, so I wonder if the new results of the social temporal distance can be also alternatively interpreted as that investor doesn't care about social impact at all, regardless it's long-term or short-term. So in this way, it's not supporting the theory. Yeah, it's just alternative explanation in that way.
Yeah, I think that would be the obvious explanation if this were a normal crowdfunding site. But in this particular case, the particular ventures are all social enterprises. And actually, the financial returns tend to be lower than would be normal in the for-profit enterprises. So I think on average, actually, if anything, the investors on this platform tend to be more socially motivated than the average investor. Now, maybe at the margin that some are still more financially motivated and don't care, but I think the kinds of people who will invest on this particular platform tend to have quite high social consciousness. In fact, many of the ventures are really promising very meager financial returns, if at all. And to some extent, it's almost like a donation. The chance of getting any money back could be quite low. But it's also relevant. That's why we chose this particular setting as opposed to a more conventional crowdfunding platform where indeed the financial motivation would override the social. Here, if anything, I think it's the social motivation that is overriding the financial.
Understand. Thanks.
Okay, Donal, I have a question about mechanisms, driving investors' patience with societal goals with long-term orientation, right? So that's basically what you generally find. Do you think it's mostly a behavioral story that investors may have some behavioral incentives making them prefer, more tolerant of long-term societal goals, or is it more like an institutional story? As we know, there's an increase in stakeholder orientation in our society these days. So I wonder whether you have done a temporal trend analysis of this stakeholder investor patience. For example, for the study 2. Right? Did you find it's a stable incentive over time, or is there any difference in the early period versus later period when the
that is great.
stakeholder?
Actually, at the moment, all we have are year fixed effects. We have not looked at exploring whether there is a difference
Right.
between the early and the later periods.
Right.
But I think that's very interesting as a way of disentangling the extent to which there may be some institutional driver and the extent to which this is more behavioral.
Yeah.
My suspicion, but again, this is only a suspicion, and I think it's a really good idea to separate the data into different time periods. My suspicion is that it's more of a behavioral story, and I think that goes back to study 1, where we find that people are, even though they are told that this donation, $1 donation is the same as one tree planted, people still react very differently when it comes to things and when it comes to money. So I think there's something about how people react intuitively to money, in the sense that we are trained to think about money in the future is worth less than it is today, even above and beyond, the value, the degree to which, inflation will erode that. So I think there's probably something quite behavioral there. Whereas if we describe this in terms of a thing, we're much less likely to discount it. And I think that is also one way of reconciling some of the other literature that shows, in fact, the literature in the behavioral economics that looks at this problem, the initial literature showed that people didn't discount environmental benefits really at all, or only minimally. The more later papers suggested that they did discount them quite a bit. Now, I think the issue there is probably the case of this magnitude problem I said, that it's difficult to compare 100 trees and $10,000. So that's why we have exactly 1 tree and $1 in study 1. But the fact that they didn't find there was no greater patience vis-a-vis environmental benefits over time, probably suggests that it's not an institutional story. But I think it's really promising. I mean, I will investigate this within the next week, actually, based on our study 2 data.
Okay, yeah. And I was wondering about, if it's really a behavioral story, what exactly is the mechanism driving investors' preference? Is it a sense of meaningfulness of adhering to social goals? Or what's your suspicion here? Why do people discount financial goals more than societal goals with a similar time horizon? What's the explanation? Yeah.
So I think one explanation is simply that people are trained, we are more accustomed, especially if you are an experienced investor, as the investors in these studies are, you're trained to think of future returns as being lower in the way that you may not think about products or things. But this also comes back to what I was saying a little bit about the social discounting and legacy planning. So what social discounting literature is all about discounting money, but for other people. So generally people, again, if it's somebody else you're thinking about, you're often concerned about legacy issues. And in some cases where it comes to legacy, actually you are thinking about long-term we have a more positive glow. So it could be that where it comes to doing good for others, we're not going to be as impatient for ourselves. But I think that's one thing. But I think the other element that is at play is indeed, so one could think about what we were expecting perhaps before study 3. We measured, I think I mentioned 3 mechanisms. We measured the level of ambition, we measured the level of impact, and we measured the level of abstraction. So what we found was that, at least in our study, it was the abstractness of the goals that created some disadvantage for social impact. But we didn't find that social impact had any negative effect on ambition or impact. But I think that's actually it's potentially the case that where you have a long-term financial social objective, then investors magnify the size of that. So on average, we didn't find that investors reacted more positively or negatively, but one could have countervailing investors, those who think this is a very ambitious project because it's going to achieve social impact in 8 years, and then others who simply discount it as being meaningless. So it could be, and again, this is something for us to investigate in the data, that actually the attitudes are more polarized rather than convergent. People are systematically negative towards the temporally distant financial return, but it seems that they may not be as agreed, they may not agree as much on the temporally distant societal benefit.
Right. So another question is about, have you considered the financial materiality of societal goals in the study 3, in addition to, assessing the impact, the abstractness, and ambition? Do investors, react more positively to societal goals that they see greater financial potential, more synergies between societal and financial goals?
So that actually is in a follow-up study that we are doing at the moment. Yeah. So
I see.
At the moment, we haven't been able to get at that, but we are indeed coding the pitches to see whether there is any articulated link between the financial strategy, business model, and the social goal. So again, at the moment I cannot say, but I think it's very plausible, and that's something we are actually looking at the moment.
I see.
I also mentioned very briefly that there is a positive, a marginally significant positive coefficient on having an aligned financial horizon and social horizon. Potentially points at that as well. That you're able to create, long-term societal benefits. Maybe these will also be the basis for a financially sustainable business model. So these are questions that I cannot answer with any confidence today, but they are elements that we are investigating. And
that's good to know. Yeah.
I think they are critical for this question, actually.
Right. Okay, let me check what are the other. Okay, I don't see new questions.
Shuping, I think there is one more.
One more question.
XS asked a question about the assumptions. Yeah.
Yeah. So the study 2, I think, is about study 2, right? The benefit maybe shouldn't be compared with each other because one is beneficial for investor, another is beneficial for other. The audience is different. The assumption is that investor totally internalize the social benefits as their own benefit, at least in their mind. The assumption may be too strong.
Yeah, I think that's natural in the sense that, as I mentioned, there are 2 attributes of societal benefits that distinguish them from financial returns. The first is that the beneficiary is different. The second, which is not always the case, but is often the case, is that the benefit is typically a benefit in kind rather than is something that is articulated in financial terms. So this is why, indeed, we were investigating whether people discount these societal benefits more or less than financial returns. Because as I mentioned, the 2 most recent papers in the behavioral economics literature actually find that prospective investors are just as impatient for environmental benefits, i.e. which go to other people, than they are for themselves. And we're questioning that because we say, well, actually, it's very difficult for those 2 studies to actually compare directly the environmental and the financial returns because of this magnitude problem. So that's why we use this particular organization, One Tree Planted, which allows us to have an equivalent monetary sum for a tree planted. But indeed, it is true. So by definition, the societal benefit will go to other people. And we're not assuming that the societal benefit goes to the individual investor. Absolutely not. And that's one of the interesting things, in the sense that if it doesn't go to the individual investor, why is the investor still, to some degree, impatient?
Yeah. Okay. May I ask another question? Because it just came to my mind. Yeah. So I was wondering, sorry, I forgot my question. I think it's about. I think it's about study 2. You have different investors, and you apparently have different investor backgrounds, right? So did you do any analysis, distinguish different types of investors and see their incentives? Because I was thinking about investors with the little experience, versus with more experiences. Their cognitive complexity might be different. You know, how they process the information could be, you know, very different.
You have put your finger on one of the limitations of study 2, which is that we do not know who the investors are. We know how many, we know how many investors there are, and we know how much money is invested, but the identities are not revealed. So that is quite an important.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I wish we were able to look at investor heterogeneity.
Right.
That would be great. We can probably do more in study 3. We have some, you know, in studies 1 and 3, we have some greater information on the demographics of the participants, but study 2 does not allow us to do that.
I was just thinking whether the cognition, the cognitive complexity of the investors actually play a role as it influences the information processing, how they interpret. You know,
I agree.
Language,
I think
right?
Indeed, and whether, you know, I think one of the interesting follow-up questions is indeed whether more cognitively complex investors are more able to see potential linkages between societal benefits and financial returns.
Yes.
No, but unfortunately, the data in terms of the investor, we have good data on the projects and ventures, but we don't have data at the individual
investors. Okay, got it. Okay. Yeah, I think we're done with the questions. Thank you again, Donal, for this wonderful presentation. Like Zhiyan said, it's a very rigorously designed research, and there's so much to learn from it. Personally, I learned a lot, and I do hope to keep in touch with you if you don't mind. Our participants might have some follow-up questions. You know, they might contact you in the future. Yeah.
Thank you, Xu, for the coordination. Thank you for your engagement. And indeed, if anybody has a question or wants to know more or has ideas for follow-up studies, just send me an email. I will be happy to reply. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Donal.
Thank you. Thank you, Xu.